I thought we'll do something a little bit different, because the basics of creating a heavily worn, chipped sort of relic blade is actually fairly simple. You only need a few colours, and you aren't doing anything hugely technical. It is just a little bit of brush control and dots and scratches, and effectively just follow the sort of technique that I'm using. So the different bit is that I want to try and work with everybody to figure out the sort of basics of non-metallic metals, specifically on swords. It's a bit different on other things, but we'll get the basics of it. So the light and dark sections, let's start with that. So the light sections are effectively a light source. Each one of those is a separate individual light source, which sometimes people kind of forget. Now, this doesn't have to be your standard light source. It's a piece of metal. It reflects quite a lot. So a light source can literally be light bouncing off a slightly lighter coloured object, like a white piece of cloth, anything like that. So at least one of your white sort of lighter sections will be something like the sun, for example, or a moon, or if you're on a distant planet or whatever. But the others can be any piece from around the environment. Now, the reason most people do it in sort of this traditional 2 on one side and 1 on the other is just for simplification, just so the blade reads as shiny with sort of minimal faffing, if you like. So you don't want to overload the viewer with too much at this small of a scale. If you go up in scale, sort of 75 millimeters, then you can put far more detail in. Apologies for the autofocus blurring issues. Trying out a new camera angle, which means I can paint a lot better on camera. But autofocus is causing a few problems at the moment, but we'll get through it. So, reason we have a darker section immediately underneath the lighter section is because of the shape of the blade. Because it is a angled blade, so a cross section of that blade is almost like a diamond shape. You want to show that those halves of the blade is pointing in a different direction, angled slightly differently. So the way that light works is that it comes from a source, such as the sun, a lamp, etc. It goes onto objects, it bounces off those objects and into your eyes. In the case of metallic and reflective materials, it comes from the source, bounces off objects, onto the metallic surface, then into your eyes. So, and it all depends on the angle of the metallic reflective surface as to what you see. So to get the idea that this blade is slightly angled, you have a dark section immediately underneath the light section. Because if you put the two light sections next to each other, obviously down the center of the blade, then it doesn't look right, because it looks like the blade should be angled, and it is in reality angled. It's an angled piece of plastic, but the light is telling you otherwise, so it confuses the eyes. It doesn't make sense from a sort of reality point of view. So that's why that happens. Now, in the case of blades with one edge, so they have a cutting edge and then the rest of it is flat, then you can go a bit further. The cutting edge can have quite a lot of these light sections sort of on there, because of the amount of objects around that could reflect light onto it. And the reason there's dark in between those as well, is just because that's how the world around us works. There's light next to dark, so it's reflecting everything around you. It's a diffuse mirror, effectively. And if you're not sure what I mean when I say diffuse, it basically means that the surface is rougher, so that the light particles that bounce off are not as many of those are hitting your eyes. So for a mirror, for example, all of the light particles that are bouncing, that are coming from the light source, bouncing off an object into the mirror and then back into your eyes, 90% of those are getting from the mirror to your eyes. If you then sprayed matte clear varnish over your mirror, please don't actually do this, but this is just an example. Hairspray might work and you can wipe that off, but if, for example, you sprayed matte varnish over it, that would roughen the surface. That would diffuse the light. So because it's rougher, those light particles are bouncing in different directions, and not all of them are hitting your eyes. So you're getting a sort of blurry facsimile of the image instead. And because sword blades are sharpened in a certain way, they're again magnitude of times rougher. So you get even less, which is why you just get sort of blocks or chunks of light. And the sharper the blade, the more detail you get, and the more colours you get as well. That's worth noting. The more colour that comes through, because obviously it's a light particle, or light wave, however you want to. I'm no scientist, but however you want to describe it, you get more of that coming through. So for a really, really old blade like this, it's really diffuse. So you're getting very little information back. So certainly no shape information. You're just getting sort of blocks, chunks of light, and they're obviously interrupted by the dents and chips and scratches on the blade itself as well, which is why we're using a sort of scratchy stippling motion and crossing over onto parts of it to show that chips and dents are effectively at the same angle. So for example, if a scratch goes across the entire blade, that means that's flattened that section, so it's all at the same angle. But back to the actual painting itself. For the original Gravis Captain blade, I started with a base of Eshin Grey rather than black. Now that does seem to work a lot better than this version. Starting from the Eshin Grey and then glazing in the black afterwards just really gave it a nice finish. That is probably the better of the two blades, but this one's not too bad. So it's literally Eshin Grey, Dawnstone, Administratum Grey, and just a tiny drop of white into the Administratum. And just work up the colours in stippling and dots and scratches. And then your power nodes are Sotek Green, Temple Guard Blue, and Baharoth Blue. You just create a thin wash, just go around the node itself, down the line, down the sort of the piping, wipe off the excess on a paper towel, and just glaze around the outside of that just to sort of extend the glow a little bit onto the blade. And that is it for the glow on the power node. Really, really simple. If you can angle the blade or sort of get the lights and darks positioned in such a way that the power node is on a darker section, that would be better, but because you're glazing, it's not too much of a bother anyway. And then once you're all done, just add a little bit of white to the Administratum Grey and just pick out a few of the deeper dents and scratches and whatnot. Some people might say that if a sword like this has a power field, why is it all dented and scratched and broken and things? Well, my theory is that these weapons are occasionally thousands of years old. Maybe they've been used in practice cages without the power fields on, things like that. And they're just well, not rusted, but certainly corroded, and the power field enables them to cut regardless of the actual condition of the blade. So that's my theory, and I'm sticking to it. So after this, we go on to a smoother version of the blade. So I literally just flip the blade over and do a smooth, slightly shinier version. Placement wise, it is absolutely identical in how you're placing it. Think about the environment that the blade is in. Think about the things you want around it, colours that might be bouncing around, and start simple with just a couple of light sources, sort of the standard one on one side, one on the other. But because it's a newer, sharper blade effectively, we don't want the stippling and whatnot. We're going with glazes instead. Is probably the easiest way of doing it. Colours themselves are slightly different. I realised my mistake from previously by not starting with Eshin Grey, so it's a base coat of Eshin Grey, not a solid one, doesn't have to be perfect. Then it's Dawnstone, and instead of anything else, I mixed a little bit of Dawn Yellow into Dawnstone to create most of the highlights, and then just added a tiny drop of white to that for the very, very brightest ones. But with this technique, there is a lot of back and forth glazing over, so you'll see it start to get brighter but rougher, and then it'll smooth out as I glaze over, but it'll dull it down slightly. So when you glaze over a section, it does tend to dull the actual colours that you're putting on, so you have to go over it again to re-brighten them very slightly. And the reason I've added Dawn Yellow is just because obviously sunlight has a lot of yellow in it that bounces off things, so you can occasionally get a yellow reflection off various things. It just gives it a bit more interest as well. You could go with any colour. You could even do a colour roulette and just roll a die, pick a couple of colours, and just go nuts and see what happens. You might end up with some bizarre combinations, but as long as you go dark enough and you go light enough, it should still look really, really good. So obviously we did the power node in the last one, so I don't bother with it on this one, but just enjoy the painting, and when we get to any more detailed sections, I'll jump in. But one thing to note as well is that curves and edges catch a lot of light, because an edge is effectively a highly condensed curve. Curves bend the light towards the viewer. They sort of squish it and compress it. And edges, like I said, are effectively a condensed type of curve. So they all catch vast amounts of light. They're catching the entirety of the environment around them, squishing it into one line, bouncing it back into the viewer at the right angle. So to get the look that you want, you need to do some edge highlights. You don't need to do all of them. You can just go over the edge highlights where it's darkest, because that's where you're going to see them. Because there's contrast between the light and dark. You're not going to necessarily see them as much over the brighter parts. So you can just do a little sort of very slightly brighter section there. You see what I mean about going over with brighter sections, it looking slightly rougher, and then we have to glaze it back again. But the overall tone, the brightness does build up very, very slowly. Always keep some paper towel around you, because that's the absolute best thing for wiping paint off the brush, but still keeping enough on there to glaze with. practice will help. You'll know exactly how thin and watered down you need the paint to be able to do it as well. And there you can see we've brightened up the edge highlight just a touch, just to start defining everything. As you can see, it goes through a really messy phase, and then when we get towards the end and we do the very brightest highlights, it all starts to come together. It's a good idea to have all of your colours onto a wet palette as well, so you can keep swapping between them. So you can go back and forth. That's quite useful. You can see we're slowly building up those edge highlights as well. You don't want just one colour. You want to build them up nice and gradually. Hopefully that camera's going to focus at some point. Here we go. As you can see there, yeah, it's still slightly rough, but just sort of glaze over some of the edges. And with this very much brighter highlight, you can see that it's all starting to come together. We do a few small chips and scratches and what's called striations. So the way a blade is cut leaves lines up and down the actual surface of the blade. If you ever look at a kitchen knife, for example, or something, there's quite distinct lines on there. So if you've got a steady hand and a sharp brush, then you can do the same on your miniatures as well. Now, have a steady hand. The brush, as you can see though, unfortunately is a curved tipped nylon disaster at the moment, so quite tricky to work with, but I wasn't going to use my only good remaining brush to do a YouTube video. So maybe when we start getting into the Golden Steve Demon stuff, I'll use that one, the Raphael. But for the moment, the cheap £1 brush will do the job. Just extend. Sometimes you find that you do the highlights a little bit too tight as well, if that's the right way of describing it. They don't spread out far enough. So just, if you've got your paints on a wet palette, just take some of the slightly darker colours and just extend it out slightly. But here we go, here's the striations, and if you spread them out, the further they get out into the darker areas, that can help blend things together and just smooth out any gradients as well. Again, hopefully this focuses properly in a second. I hope you've liked the actual sort of camera work on this one. The angle is a lot better for working with and seems to be able to get a decent up close view of painting, and it is easier to paint with as well, so you can do higher quality stuff, because high quality paintwork means being comfortable when painting and at the right distance, and distance is really difficult to achieve. You're usually too far away when you're trying to film stuff. So with this I can get a little bit closer. So So a few more striations there, just slightly brighter colour. You could even do some dots, just pure white on those lighter areas as well, just to really make it shine. But I didn't want this one super shiny, just a bit shinier. The odd chip and whatnot on the edge of the blade. It is a working blade after all, as far as I'm concerned. Nothing in the Warhammer universe should ever be absolutely perfect, and obviously unless you're a bright blue ultramarine, and even then it should be weathered. But thanks very much for watching, really appreciate it, and hope to see you again next time. Bye bye.